today. This is my first time to attend this meeting, and I'm liking the diversity of different talks that are here. And as you can see, mine's kind of the other extreme to the previous two talks. The work that I do, I'm actually a extension specialist, so I do outreach to the farmers, specifically cotton farmers across the state of Texas, and also conduct applied research on various applied topics that I can directly relate to the farmers across the state. One of the things we faced across the Blacklands of Texas, that's basically where we're at now, down to about Austin, Texas, and then along the Gulf of Texas, from Houston down to Corpus Christi, Texas, is we've experienced a lot of potassium deficiencies showing up in our cotton. And although many of these fields are actually meeting our current soil threshold levels for potassium levels, we're still seeing the symptomology in these fields. So the research that we initiated in 2012 was to try to address the problem. Why are we seeing these differences in these fields, and even those that are meeting or well exceeding the current thresholds? Potassium, it's used a lot in the plant for various things that help it deal with stress, as was mentioned in the previous talk. In cotton specifically, it's used in the largest amount next to nitrogen, and it's used for various things, specifically drought stress. So a lot of the cotton grown in Texas is the largest cotton producer in the United States, producing typically about 50% of the acres in the U.S. are actually grown here in Texas. And in probably about 75% of that acreage is dryland cotton production. So dealing with moisture stress is actually a very big concern. And then also potassium plays a big role in physiological and also biochemical plant processes, again, that was previously mentioned. Many functions of potassium: builds cellulose and reduces lodging, activates over 60 enzymes, aids in photosynthesis, helps translocate sugars, produces grains rich in starch, and increases protein content in plants. And again, it enhances drought, and it's also been shown to enhance disease resistance. The potassium uptake in cotton. Cotton is a perennial plant that we grow as an annual plant. It has a taproot system, so it doesn't have the fibrous root systems of corn, sorghum, wheat, and those kinds of things. So we typically see the potassium deficiencies much earlier in cotton than we do in many of the other grain crops. And we're kind of wondering whether this is somewhat of a yellow canary for potassium deficiencies across this entire soils. In cotton specifically, very important in bulb development and fiber elongation, and again, stress mitigation. And this graph over here just kind of shows when we have our major potassium uptake, basically when we get to that mid-square, which is the flower bloom, our pre-bloom, we get a huge, tremendous amount of uptake. And what we think may be happening here is basically the plant can't take them enough during that extreme demand to meet its needs and its full yield potential. It's estimated to need about 60 pounds of potassium to make 1 bale of cotton, which is about 500 pounds of lint. The other thing is some work's been shown that shows the impact of potassium in dry root weight based on application rates of potassium and increase in overall root biomass, which of course also helps promote drought tolerance. And potassium is a very complex cycle, especially on these heavy clay soils that we have in the Blacklands of Texas and along the Gulf Coast of Texas, where we have a lot of fixation in those heavy clay soils, those 2-to-1 clay soils that we have that help. It's hard to really predict the amount of potassium that's going to be available to that plant during the season. We have some that's readily available, then some that's very slow to release, and then some that's basically not available at all. And there's a large portion of this project that we're not going to talk about today, but it's looking at the soil aspect and the release and the flux of that potassium in that soil over time, depending on moisture conditions and other factors in those soils. But again, the basic overall demand, we think kind of what's going on again is that we have the demand is exceeding the supply. There may be plenty of potassium there, but it's not able to take it up quickly enough, and then that's leading to potassium deficiencies in the leaves. Because what happens in cotton, like a lot of other plants, you have the translocation of potassium from the leaves to the fruiting structures. and that's why we see those symptoms first in the leaves, but we also know we're probably hurting our yield quite a bit. So we kind of look back at this about what's changed in the cotton industry, because really this observation of potassium deficiency has really increased, it seems like, over the past decade, and really it's come to light at about the past 4 or 5 years. And that could be partially due to some of the droughts and other things that have been going on. But something else has changed, and these won't mean a whole lot to you guys and ladies, but this is basically the main stem nodes on a cotton plant and the number of bolls per acre for these different varieties. So the more modern varieties are these listed here first, the blue and red, and then some of these others here. So those ones that really put on a lot of fruit really quickly in the season. They load up very quickly, and then they taper off their yield potential, their boll development quite quickly. And then this green variety here, Delta Pine 555, which dominated the cotton acreage across much of the U.S. For literally a decade, you can see that its fruiting development is much different, where you have the very prolonged fruiting period across much of the entire season, very indeterminate growth. So we didn't typically see potassium deficiency symptoms in cotton varieties that grow like this. So because the demand is not there in such a timely manner as some of these other varieties. But I should back up to say the reason this variety was replaced is because these other ones are actually yielding higher under optimum conditions. That's why these companies have released these other varieties. The other thing that's changed quite a bit is the overall yield potential of our cotton. Over the past 30 plus years, we've seen a dramatic increase in yield potential, looking at about 10 to 13 pounds of lint per acre per year. So we're increasing the demand on the potassium as these yields are increasing. But if you look at the overall fertilizer use across the entire U.S., we see with nitrogen, basically our yield, as it somewhat mimics our yield potential over the past 50 years. But if you look at potassium and phosphorus both, basically we've been flat. The application rates have been flat since about the mid to late 70s. So our yields have nearly doubled in that same time frame, but the amount of phosphorus and potassium that's being applied to these crops are more or less staying the same. So what that means is we're mining our soils. And that's basically what this slide shows. This is a software program that IP&I developed. It's called IP&I is the International Plant Nutrition Institute. It's called New GIS, and they have these for all the different elements, but I printed it out for potassium, obviously, and it's a potassium balance estimate. And this is the most recent one from 2012, where basically they know the amount of potassium that's being purchased and the amount of yields that are coming off those fields. And they can determine whether we're mining those soils or we're applying excess amount of those nutrients. So as you get into the yellow and then the orange, we're looking at mining in many cases, especially through Texas and the Mississippi Delta region. We're mining or removing over 50 pounds of potassium per acre per year that's not being replenished. So it would lead us to believe that over time, obviously, we're going to have to replenish that at some point in time. And again, the major cotton production regions in Texas through here, but primarily out in West Texas, where their soil potassium levels are quite high, but again, at the removal rate of 10 to 50 pounds per acre, at some point we're going to be reaching potassium deficiencies there too. And we're trying to promote our producers to basically develop some sort of maintenance program so that they don't completely mine those nutrients out of both phosphorus and potassium. This is where the study area was for some of the research I'm going to talk about today. We're right up here in this part of Texas now, but this is the Blacklands of Texas, and again along the Gulf Coast. And we've been taking deep profile soil samples down to 4 feet deep and testing those soil nutrient levels. And we basically did a survey to determine the level of potassium and phosphorus and other nutrients in there. We know for nitrogen, we have excess amounts of nitrogen in most of those fields. And in many cases where we've done nitrogen rate trials, we don't even get a yield response to applied nitrogen. because there's plenty down in that soil profile. Now, obviously, over time, that could be mined too, over a couple years actually, but we have excess amounts of nitrogen, but we more or less, in many cases, we're depleting potassium and phosphorus in these soils. But back to this experiment, we had a lot of different studies with a total of 12 site years. Again, prior to going into it, we collected soil samples down to 48 inches. Our current recommendation is take soil samples down 0 to 6 inches. And what we're realizing is obviously that's not the only amount of soil that those plants are seeing. And we need to be taking and recommending people to take deeper samples to get a better picture of what those plants are actually seeing. Kind of a standardized arrangement here, at least 4 replicates, 4-row plots. The spacing depended on which field we were in. And all these trials were done in producers' fields. And basically we looked at different rates of potassium chloride, either liquid or granular. The current standard is granular applications and incorporating that granular potassium chloride anywhere from 1 inch to 2 inches deep. And then, but we started looking at in 2012, one was kind of due to the oil boom industry and the fracking industry, where the fracking industry was using liquid potassium chloride quite a bit. So we had a readily available source of potassium chloride that we could initiate some of this. And the initial trial was created to try to reduce the amount of potassium it's going to be applied by banding it where those roots can pick it up more efficiently, and we could possibly cut the rate in half and save the farmers some money. The current recommendation for phosphorus is along those lines. If you band it right close to where the seed is going, then you can reduce those phosphorus rates in half. But basically we did a range, did untreated. We actually had 2 untreated in many of these trials, up to 160 pounds. And the increments you see there, again, broadcast incorporated and injected. And this is just a old injection rig that we have, and you can see putting it in the field. About 4 inches deep and about 6 inches deep and 4 inches to the side. Again, heavy clay soils for all these sites that we have, and the parts per million of the potassium varied depending on the location and the soil type, but some locations were as low as 50 and some were as high as nearly 300 part per million, and in one location up to 390 part per million. Our current threshold for potassium is 125 part per million based on the Mehlich 3 soil extraction method, and we'll talk about that in a little bit and where we got responses in relation to that. But from a plant physiology perspective, lay this out. This is the leaf K levels. We pulled leaf samples at about 4 weeks after first bloom. For the Wharton location in Williamson County, these are just the 2015 results. And you can see as our potassium rate increased, we were able to get a significant increase in the amount of potassium going into those leaves. We did have obviously quite a bit of difference between the locations. And the other thing we noticed is at one of the locations anyway, the injected application, the solid line, was much more effective in getting that potassium into the plant. And this is a very busy slide, but this is the lint yields for the 12 site years that we had on farmers' fields. And this is our current threshold. It's pretty much fairly uniform across the United States, about 125 part per million for Mehlich 3 extraction. And we can see below that mark, we got responses in most situations. But additionally, in many locations, we also got responses well above that current threshold. So one of the things we want to identify here is should we modify that current threshold level in order to optimize yields. This is when the study started in 2012, and this really opened our eyes to some of the opportunities and maybe the limitations we're having from deficiencies in cotton and deficiencies in lack of yield. This is kind of backwards here, but untreated on this side, 40, 80, and 120 of the broadcast incorporated. And again, the broadcast incorporated is our current recommendation, is to broadcast incorporate potassium. But you look at these injected applications here. So the threshold for this, the potassium recommendation for this particular location was about 60 pounds of potassium to be applied. So looking at the broadcast incorporated application method, our current threshold is probably actually fairly accurate. But if we look at the injected applications from 40 pounds, we got a very significant yield response even up to 120 pounds. Above, again, significantly above the broadcast incorporated application. Basically doubling those yields by getting that potassium there where those roots can uptake it. And this is some of the other locations, 2013, Williamson and Wharton County. Many of these slides will be very similar with the lint yield here and then the application rates here with broadcast and then injected here. But we can see in 2013 we didn't get a significant response from the broadcast incorporated, but we did get a very significant response from the injected application in Wharton in 2013 and kind of a similar situation in Williamson County in 2013 as well. And then the return on investment, this is the slide that my farmers care the most about, this is what they want to look at, is what's the return on investment. And you can see it was also very significant over the untreated check, and then also the injected being much more cost effective than the broadcast incorporated. Now moving to 2014 and 2015, this gets back to some of the comments that Dr. Verma made. In these situations, we did not have potassium limiting, especially at some of these high applications rates, but we had other stress situations going on which trumped the potassium application. And unfortunately, dealing with applied research trials, we run into things like this fairly commonly, especially dryland research trials. But we can see in the untreated check, we've had probably some numerical differences, slight significant differences in some of these applications rate, but really no consistency across there in Williamson County in 2015, but 2014, no difference in any of those treatments at all. And these locations here were the adjacent to the 2012 and 2013 locations. So we would have expected to get a significant yield response, but again, some of the other environmental factors trumped these potassium application rates. So return on investment, basically, as you would expect, no significant benefit there. The other thing we've noticed, at least in 1 year, is the effect of late-season foliar diseases. And this happened to be 2012 when we got a very substantial yield response. On the right side here is the 120 pound of potassium injected, and then on the left side is our 0 potassium applied to that field. And you can see the difference in the foliar disease symptoms there, where it had more than sufficient potassium. We know that fiber quality is very closely linked to adequate potassium in the cotton plant. So basically, in summary, we didn't see any differences when soil Malic 3 extraction methods were above 200 part per million, less than 200 part per million. It was a bit erratic across those various years. So to conclude this, the sites with greater than 200 part per million potassium, which again is well above our current threshold, they were non-responsive. But applications, methods, and rates have an effect and affect yield at about 200 part per million or less. In 2/3 of our sites, we got a significant yield response from that, anywhere from 60 to 200 part per million, which again, our threshold's 125, and our responses were much more consistent when we used the liquid injected application, and our efficiency increased dramatically. And probably we're working on this now with the soil testing lab, and we actually have a belt-wide trial, which is across the cotton belt going on, basically mimicking these exact same trials to try to get some uniform standard for developing thresholds across the entire cotton belt, and more than likely adapting or modifying our current threshold of 125 part per million. So across the entire cotton belt, we have 14 locations in nearly every state across the cotton belt where we're looking at these exact same treatments. We're also going to do some mineralogy work to try to figure out the exchange rate and the plant available potassium and try to fine-tune that and figure out how it should be incorporated into our current threshold and possibly modify that. But these are the locations we have across the entire cotton belt that occurred in 2015 and will occur again in 2016. So we have a pretty good representation of the entire cotton belt here, and hopefully the results will be fairly favorable. This research was funded by Cotton Incorporated, IP&I, and also the Fluid Fertilizer Foundation. It was a compilation of all these funding sources together, and those are our different cooperators we've had. And I'll be happy to answer any questions anyone has at this point in time.
Questions? Yes.
Yes.
Potassium uptake is actually controlled by sodium potassium antiporter, which is a vacuolar enzyme basically. So,
Sorry, we can hear you.
yeah, the potassium uptake is actually controlled by sodium potassium antiporter enzyme, which is a vacuolar tonoplast membrane enzyme. So it's more of a ratio between the potassium and sodium that matters. So maybe in those soils where you had a different response, maybe the sodium was very high. So I think two need to be looked at the same time so that you have a ratio profile rather than one element profile.
Sure.
Yeah.
And that's a very good comment. We have that information, and that's worth looking at. And also, I think magnesium, and the magnesium-potassium ratio is also important. And we're hoping to fine-tune that soil testing recommendation, because to me it's very generic now, and it needs to be specified more based on these ratios or soil types or types of clay or things like that.
Did you say root development is a factor in terms of potassium? In other words, if you have better root development, you will get more potassium uptake, did you say?
That's
so
correct.
If you had something to enhance root development, you would also enhance. Can you ever put too much potassium in a field? In other words, to plant something else in that field subsequently?
I'm sure there's some excessive level, but it would have to be pretty high. I mean, a lot of the fields we're looking at that are their native potassium level is over 500 part per million. But I'm sure it's like most things. I mean, you could basically cause a salt problem, but
Solid potassium field.
yeah.
Any other issues, please?
Unlike other plants, cotton plant is very sensitive to potassium deficiency soils, you said. But in one place you said the lint is increased
Use it.
very high in the deficiency soils. Even in the potassium deficiency soils, there is a very much increase in the lint in one of your study. In the second case, even the potassium levels is high, that is 125 ppbf. Again, you notice very much yield. Then how you will low potassium, more yield, high potassium, more yield? How you will justify these two things?
So, if I caught the question correctly, I mean, when there's sufficient potassium, or basically we're not getting a yield response, right? Despite our potassium levels. And it gets back to those abiotic stresses where in one particular year it was extremely wet and then we turned extremely dry, and basically 3/4 of the fruit that were on that cotton plant literally aborted. So because of that situation, that stress and the loss of those fruit, we weren't able to identify that difference. The variety also plays into it. Again, if you have a variety that's pulling out potassium over a longer period of time, then you're less likely to see that stress period. In other situations, you may develop a better root system that then you're less likely to run in those potassium deficiency symptoms too. A lot of this work, if we had, and you guys all deal with this too, I'm sure, is if we had a better way to know what those roots were actually doing, we could better predict, what these plants' overall growth is going to be. So in some of those years, we may have not had good root development or excess of root development, and it was able to take advantage of what was natively in that soil.
The areas that you have studied, really they are deficient in potassium at the southern and central part of Texas?
At the end of the year, do we see potassium deficiencies? That was your question? We do in some years. In drought years, it's always worse. And again, that's because similar to what was mentioned earlier, if you're not taking up the water, you're not taking up the nutrients with it. And I think that's a big part of what we see specifically in drought years.